Hi, my name's Linda Lannom, and I'm a co-facilitator of the CLL Patient and Caregiver Support Group in Oberlin, Ohio. I've been asked to talk about the importance of ASH from the perspective of a CLL patient's care partner. First, a little background. In 2012, when my husband Larry and I were still living in the Washington, D.C. area, Larry was diagnosed with CLL. Naturally, I was sure his diagnosis was a mistake. The lab had probably mixed up his results and someone else's. So Larry repeated the blood work. There was no mistake. Did we have a clue about what CLL was? Not really. I remember going to the National Cancer Institute's Physicians Data Query website to read the review article about CLL. All I remember after reading through the article were two words: fatal and incurable. Our primary care doc recommended a local hematologist oncologist. I looked him up in PubMed. No publications, so probably no interest in research, but he'd gone to a decent medical school and he was in the Washingtonian Magazine's list of best doctors in DC. So we made an appointment. The specialist ordered a FISH test. We hoped for the best. We did not get it. Nevertheless, the specialist was relentlessly cheerful as he talked about the standard of care for CLL, which at that time was fludarabine, cyclophosphamide, and rituximab, or FCR, combination of two chemotherapy drugs and one monoclonal antibody. Larry had already announced that he would refuse to take chemotherapy, which was kind of a limiting factor. We decided to see a specialist at Johns Hopkins, which is an NCI designated comprehensive cancer center. This specialist was interested in research, and he was the college roommate of the husband of a friend of mine. So we hoped we might be able to forge a bond with him. And we did like him. He seemed to know more about CLL than the local doc. He did an IGVH test, and we hoped for the best. Again, we did not get it. He suggested that when Larry needed treatment, bendamustine, a kinder, gentler chemo drug combined with rituximab, might be the way to go. After a year or so, that physician left Hopkins to take a job at Yale. The backup doc at Hopkins seemed to be interested only in stem cell transplant, which Larry had also ruled out. However, in the meantime, we'd made several important discoveries. CLL was a rare cancer, but there were resources out there. At the time, we lived about a mile from the National Institutes of Health, and they were doing a study of the natural history of CLL. Would they be interested in including Larry? Why, yes, they would. So we met Adrian Wiesner, who did a lot of research on CLL. I ran into a blog written by Brian Kaufman, a family physician who had been diagnosed with CLL when he was even younger than my husband. And hey, he was still alive. I joined a variety of CLL listservs of varying quality, and I stumbled on a website produced by Chaya Venkat called CLL Topics. Chaya was a caregiver, and she was not a physician, but nevertheless, she seemed to have dug deeply into the CLL literature and was even writing papers with some of the CLL docs. I began to read the abstract of every article about CLL that turned up in PubMed each month, and to read the whole article if I could get it relatively cheaply. And I began to figure out that professional meetings would be where the really new results of clinical trials would be presented. Larry and I are originally from Chicago, which is where the American Society of Clinical Oncology, or ASCO, has its annual meeting. And that's where we went a few months after Larry's diagnosis. I signed us up for every continuing medical education session about CLL. We heard sessions presented by John Bird, Stephen Coutre, Susan O'Brien, and I'm sure others. And what were they talking about? Clinical trial data, brand new clinical trial data. In short, news we could use. ASCO is a huge meeting and it probably attracts about 40,000 people, but it doesn't focus on hematology. And one can't help but notice that not many sessions are devoted to CLL, which is a relatively rare cancer. So, possibly rooting around in Brian's blog or elsewhere, I discovered the annual meeting of the American Society of Hematology, or ASH, a meeting and exposition devoted only to malignant and non-malignant hematology. The ASH meeting is the premier annual event in hematology. It probably attracts about 30,000 people from all over the world, all devoted to hematology. Over the space of a few days each year, this meeting offers literally hundreds of recent papers and posters about CLL, and many of them describe the results of clinical trials of drugs or drug combinations not yet approved by FDA for CLL. In other words, tomorrow's treatments. Treatments that might turn CLL into a non-fatal, curable cancer. So what CLL topics does ASH cover? Obviously, this varies from year to year. For example, this year, John Gribben reported on the results of the phase 3 Unity CLL trial, looking at ublituximab and umbralisib. Bill Weirda presented the results of the phase 2 Captivate study, evaluating ibrutinib and venetoclax for first-line treatment of CLL. He also described the results of the phase 1 cohort of Lysocell in combination with ibrutinib for relapsed refractory CLL patients. And Anthony Mato described the results of the phase 1/2 Bruin study of LAXO 305. Not all the papers describe clinical trial data. Some describe laboratory work, and some report on real-world data from prospective observational registries. Now, why is it important for CLL caregivers to know about this stuff? Well, it's because CLL is still mostly an incurable disease that shortens the lives of too many. These patients and their caregivers always need to be looking for the next likely treatment. And that treatment may well be in a clinical trial or a treatment that has recently obtained FDA approval because of a clinical trial. You can read about clinical trials in clinicaltrials.gov, but to hear about the brand new results of clinical trials, you need to pay attention to presentations at meetings like ASH. Here's my husband's experience in a nutshell. He was diagnosed in 2012. He was in watch and wait until June 2014, when he landed in the hospital for a week with a viral, bacterial, and possibly fungal infection because he didn't watch closely enough and waited a little too long. But he got out of that alive. We'd hoped he might qualify for a phase 2 clinical trial of ibrutinib at the NIH, but that trial closed before he needed treatment. So his first treatment was in a phase 3 clinical trial that offered 3 arms: ibrutinib alone, ibrutinib with rituximab, or the then standard of care for older CLL patients, bendamustine and rituximab. Unfortunately, Larry was assigned to the standard of care arm in that trial, and he dropped out after 1.5 cycles because the standard of care proved to be too toxic for him. He required his second treatment in less than a year, and he entered a phase 2 trial of acalabrutinib at the National Institutes of Health. That went very well for about 4 years, and we were probably beginning to be a little too complacent about it. He developed the C481S mutation and had to leave the trial. We scurried around quite a bit looking for his next treatment. Originally, he thought he might try a phase 1/2 trial of ublituximab, umbralisib, and venetoclax offered at the Cleveland Clinic by Brian Hill. However, the pharmaceutical company excluded him because of his prior adverse reaction to rituximab. It was then that the support group network kicked in and saved the day. Larry and I co-founded the CLL Society's Washington, D.C. area support group in 2017, and we'd stayed in touch with some of the members after we moved to Ohio. I mentioned that we were clinical trial shopping again because Larry had become resistant to acalabrutinib, and one of the members mentioned that he'd recently seen Jennifer Woyak at Ohio State, and she was about to start a phase 1 trial of LAXO 305, a selective non-covalent BTK inhibitor. It was designed to reversibly bind BTK, preserve activity in the presence of acquired resistance, and avoid off-target kinases. We knew about it, but we did not know that there was a study site located relatively nearby because Ohio State was not yet listed as a location for this trial in clinicaltrials.gov. We didn't know anybody at Ohio State, so I called Loxo to verify if Larry would meet the inclusion criteria. The person with whom I spoke thought he would. He contacted Ohio State, they contacted us, and within a month, Larry had been screened and enrolled in the trial. The moral of the story is, it's not just what you know, it's also who you know. And this, in my view, is why support groups are an important addition to the papers presented at ASH. So in closing, smart patients get smart care. This is not just a catchy slogan. This is the CLL Society's best advice. If you want the best care for yourself or someone else, you need to become as knowledgeable about CLL as you can. I think of it as a three-step program. One, find a CLL expert or several experts to help you. Two, make connections with other CLL patients and caregivers through support groups. And three, keep up with new research by paying attention to new publications and to papers presented at professional meetings like ASH. Thanks very much.